ana ngā hiahia katoa, e kore hoki e ngaro i a koe te mea hona. Whakahāngia iho tau wairua tapu, hei whakamā i ngā whakaro o mātou ngāko. Kia tino araha ai mātou, ki a koe, kia tika ai te whakanui i tau ingoa tapu, ko ihu karaiti hoki tō mātou ariki. Āmine. Let's come now to a reading from 2 Samuel, I must stop saying 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, chapter 7 and beginning at verse 1. When King David was settled in his palace and the Lord had given him rest from all the surrounding enemies, the king summoned Nathan the prophet. Look, David said, I'm living in a beautiful cedar palace, but the ark of God is out there in a tent. Nathan replied to the king, Go ahead and do whatever you have in mind, for the Lord is with you. But that same night the Lord said to Nathan, Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord has declared. Are you the one to build a house for me to live in? I've never lived in a house from the day I brought the Israelites out of Egypt until this very day. I have always moved from one place to another with a tent and a tabernacle as my dwelling. Yet no matter where I have gone with the Israelites, I have never once complained to Israel's tribal leaders, the shepherds of my people Israel. I have never asked them, Why haven't you built me a beautiful cedar house? Now go and say to my servant David, This is what the Lord of heaven's armies has declared. I took you from tending sheep in the pasture and selected you to be the leader of my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have destroyed all your enemies before your eyes. Now I will make your name as famous as anyone who has ever lived on the earth, and I will provide a homeland for my people Israel, planting them in a secure place where they will never be disturbed. Evil nations won't oppress them, as they've done in the past, starting from the time I appointed judges to rule my people Israel, and I will give you rest from all your enemies. Furthermore, the Lord declares that he will make a house for you, a dynasty of kings. For when you die and are buried with your ancestors, I will raise up one of your descendants, your own offspring, and I will make his kingdom strong. He is the one who will build a house, a temple for my name, and I will secure his royal throne forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. If he sins, I will correct and discipline him with the rod, like any father would do, but my favour will not be taken from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I removed from your sight. Your house and your kingdom will continue before me for all time, and your throne will be secure forever. So Nathan went back to David and told him everything the Lord had said in this vision. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. Thanks be to God. Well, this is one of the really wonderful points, both today's reading and then what we're going to hear tomorrow in David's response to the message that Nathan brings from the Lord. But as we look at this, I wonder if you notice the way that the picture is turned a little bit upside down. And this is a very helpful reminder to us of the way we work with God. It's become very common these days to talk about mission as rather than just something we go and do on God's behalf, it's our participation with God in what he is doing. And it's absolutely true. That is a much better way to think of it. It's not as if I go off and do stuff and then thankfully, God thinks, oh, thank goodness somebody did it because I couldn't have done it. Instead, the image is rightly that God is active in the world, in his world, for his creation, and we share with him in that work because of his kindness to us. But a while ago I saw an image going around on Facebook that was a very good illustration of the precise relationship between the way we share in God's mission and how God does it. And it was a picture of two people clearing snow from the path outside the front of their house. One of them was clearly the father of the family, and the other one was a little, maybe a 2 or 3 year old child who was enthusiastically helping to clear the snow, but the snow was this high. And it was obvious where the strength, the power, the actual ability to clear the snow came from, and it wasn't from the tiny little toddler. And so there's this helpful illustration there of the way that we participate in God's mission, but it's not because of our power or strength or even our great ideas that any of this stuff happens. And in this passage we see that David has what to him is a pretty cool idea. Nathan thinks it's a pretty cool idea initially as well. And then God says to him something which turns the picture upside down. So David says, look, it's not fair that I'm living in a great place and the Lord, Yahweh, is stuck wandering around in a tent. And that seems pretty back to front to me, so I'm going to fix it up. Now, this is not an uncommon idea in the ancient Near East. The general feeling was that you should do something for your God, and then the God might do some stuff for you, and it's quite transactional, and it's also, we as human beings do this stuff first, so we make the sacrifice or we do the temple building, and then hopefully the divine realm, the spiritual world, will look favourably on us, will do good stuff for us, or at least leave us alone and not harass us. This was the common picture, and kings especially would make promises. They'd say, I'm building you, my God, this temple, and then, I'm doing this because I expect that the God will now be very kind to me. But I wonder if you noticed the language that's used here in this passage. David says, I will build you a house. But then have you noticed what God says back to David? He says to David, I will build your house. I will build you a house that will last forever. Before David even built, in fact, David's not allowed to build the house during his own lifetime. And so what this is illustrating to us is that what is primary is God's graciousness. In other words, that he acts towards us before we act towards him. We don't buy his kindness or his goodness or his love by the things that we have done. God loves us first. And then, of course, we have opportunity to respond. But do you see where the initiative lies? Do you see where the power to bring change lies? It's not with us. It's not even with our good ideas. Even if, like David, we're willing to place them before God in this way, which is a wonderful model to imitate. But this passage is not mostly about a model that David is setting out that we should imitate. It's mostly to remind us that no matter how excellent our ideas and mission, actually it's God who takes the initiative and who speaks first. And there's even a little bit of humour here, because God says, by the way, it's almost like he's painting a picture of humility. And he says, I didn't really mind wandering around in a tent. That was all good. And of course what he's highlighting is, why did he wander around in a tent all this time? Why was his presence not given a permanent place? Well, it's because his people were wandering. And when you know the story, you'll know his people wander because of their own stupid fault much of the time. And what God's saying is, I don't mind being in this position as long as I can be with my people, my wayward, wandering people, because I love them so much that I'm going to be with them. He's reminding David that his present situation arose because of his gracious love for his people Israel. And now he's saying that even the temple building is going to be, the normal picture will be reversed. He promises David an eternal house, and then he says, by the way, you can't build a house for me, but your son can, after you've seen that this promise is coming about. And I wonder if you notice too that whereas building a temple is always going to be a temporary thing, no matter how amazing a building you make, at some stage it's going to degrade and fail. But here, God makes some extraordinary aspects in his promise to David. And I want to highlight these as they're raised. I think I mentioned before this wonderful pair of commentaries by Dale Ralph Davis on 1 and 2 Samuel. And he talks about some of these aspects of God's promise that are really significant. So one of them is that God's promise is constant. And there's a lovely Hebrew word that's used for this to express some of this, which is chesed. And it's this unfailing love that God has when he makes an agreement with his people. It's very different from ours. It's very different from David's. You've already seen that David, about 3 or 4 days ago, we saw that David wasn't even able to stay faithful to one wife, but has gradually added in his human relationships an indication of his inability to have that kind of constant love. But God promises here that his love is absolutely constant. And this comes across in 3 ways. One of them is that even death cannot defeat this love. Now, of course, in marriage relationships, we actually say in the service, until death us do part. We recognize that even the greatest human bond of marriage is in the end defeated by death. But here God says that his promise to David is not going to be defeated by death itself. We also know that our own human relationships, with the best of intentions, are often defeated by what the scriptures call sin. Those things we do which are against God's standards, which are against actually, in the end, even what we wish for ourselves in our better moments. And we find this with our own relationships. We find that we wake up in the morning wanting to do good and to be kind, and we find ourselves incapable of doing it. And God says here, even when there's sin in your household and your descendants, my promise will still stand. There'll be consequences, but there won't be an end to the relationship. And of course, we see that particularly as the story carries on through the Old Testament, and it's left dangling at the end, but we'll get to that in a moment. And then finally he says that this isn't going to be defeated by time. And of course, any ordinary promise around a physical building, a physical house, is going to be defeated by time. Some buildings, like the pyramids, last for a very long time, but you'd have to say even they're not looking quite as flash as they once did. And yet this promise that God makes is one that is timeless or everlasting. In fact, there's a beautiful way of putting it there that's really taken as forever. This is a household that will last forever. And of course, as Christian readers of this promise, when we see the disappointment of David's line gradually drifting more and more into sin as the story carries on, and we see the promise of Israel to be a light to the entire world fading away until it sometimes feels like there's not much hope left. As Christian readers, we find that that flickering flame is brought back into brilliant light, the light of the sun in Jesus Christ, who fulfills all the hopes that are placed here in David, and in God's providence also fulfills God's promise to all of us. David's name does become famous, but David's descendant, Jesus' name, becomes even more famous as the fulfillment of these promises. And so we too can trust that death will not defeat God's promises to us. We will stand again one day at the resurrection. Our own sin and failure will not defeat God's promises to us. And I wonder if that's a comfort to you, if you feel the burden and shame of what you've done wrong. Even your own sin cannot turn away God's covenant love. There may be consequences for you in this life, but God's promise to you will not be defeated by your failure. And then time itself cannot overcome it. Up on my wall, you can't see it from there, but up on my wall I have a little chart and above it says Tempus Fugit, time flies, and it's to remind me that my time in this life is very short. But God's promise here to David is everlasting. It is for all eternity. And in Jesus Christ we find that that promise comes and flowers into beautiful life for us, because it says that even though time flies in this life, I find that just like this promise to David, I've received the promise of a life that will carry on forever after the resurrection. So this promise to David is striking and wonderful, but it's a promise that comes to life for us in the person and the life, death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and gives us hope for the future. That means that we ought to respond, not so much like David did, or was actually Solomon, by building a temple made of physical things, but we ought to respond in gratitude by building God's living temple now, which is the church. If these promises are great, let's respond with great participation in what God is doing, by a great commitment to building this living temple that God is creating now, the church, so that it is beautiful, so that it is a compelling portrayal of God in this world, so that it is a place where other people encounter these wonderful promises too. He runga I te ingoa te matua, te tama, me te wairua tapu. Amen. Well, let's continue with a prayer that is actually a song of praise of the church back to God, one offering of gratitude in response to God's promises, the Te Deum. Oh, this has come up with the wrong words on my screen. I'm going to flick through and see if I do actually have the Te Deum coming up afterwards. Oh, no, it looks like I don't. So we won't say the Te Deum together. Maybe I'll have a go at that tomorrow. And for now, we'll finish up with the grace. Kia tau kia tātou katoa, te atawhai o tō tātou ariki o ihu karaiti, me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhi ngā tahitanga ki te wairua tapu, ake, ake ake, āmene.